Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen. I'm so pleased you joined me for today's show, and I must apologize. My camera in my laptop has died, and we are traveling, and I have no way to fix it for now. So I have to sit here with no camera on. Otherwise, you would see me, especially if you're listening to this on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord. I must apologize. But I must tell you, today is a very, very special episode as we are exploring the location-specific tenancy guidelines for 10 states and provinces, including British Columbia, Hawaii, Ontario, Washington State, New York State, California, Texas, Nebraska, Vermont, and the Province of Manitoba. But this episode isn't actually the episode. Today's episode is just a summary of what is live for you in the library right now. I've been working so hard. I'm so happy to deliver these to you. You see, for every one of these 7 states and 3 provinces I just mentioned, there is a dedicated podcast for each one. It's live right now in the My Life as a Landlord podcast library. And if you want to find them on the website at mylifeasalandlord.com, look under location-specific resources. You'll find them there as well. But in all of my location-specific episodes, I do go into detail by screen sharing and reviewing hyperlinks into the state or province, landlord, tenant, law, code, etc., along with as many location-specific resources I could possibly find, including phone numbers, emails, webpage, associations, Facebook groups, and so much more. You just never know what is going to come out in these location-specific podcasts. I continue to be shocked every day when I record these. It's pretty incredible. I just recorded the first 10 and I was amazed what I learned, including lead-based paint disclosures, what to do with abandoned cars and tenants' personal property items, how different places don't include a tenant's death or including an authorized party in the event of a tenant's death. There's just so many things. It's really fascinating. I also learned about so many resources and how to help landlords just like you and me in these locations and beyond. Now, I can't do all the states, provinces, and territories in the US and Canada at one time. I mean, are you trying to kill me? So I'm trying to do them over time. My goal is to have them all done by the end of 2026 or before. But by the end of 2026, there will be a dedicated podcast to every province, state, and territory in both Canada and the United States, which does include Guam, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, and the US Virgin Islands. So it's quite a few for those of you who are counting. So periodically, we will publish a bunch of these location-specific podcasts overnight and maybe not tell you about them. So regarding the 10 areas in the location-specific podcast, we just went live, including the 7 US states and 3 Canadian provinces. Let's talk about what we go through in each one of these frameworks. And then we'll go through a few examples. So each one of my location-specific podcasts is set up the same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of tenancy laws in that area? What are some of the nuances of this location? Like what stands out, especially since I review this stuff often? What is some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in a unit? And then where can you get help in that local area? That's the 4 things that we look at in all of these locations, regardless of the geographic area. But here's a sample of what you can expect from the 10 location-specific podcasts that are live in the library right now. So British Columbia. British Columbia is where I grew up as a landlord. British Columbia has incredible pre-made forms that can be filled out right online, and then you print them and sign them. It's amazing. BC has a security and a pet damage deposit, and you are required as a landlord to deliver a lease within 21 days to the tenant. You can only do 1 notice of rent increase per year, and you are limited on how much you can increase that rent based on what the province tells you each year. It changes all the time. You can charge pet rent, but you have to calculate it as a part of the rent. You can't have a separate line item. You can discriminate against smokers. I know because I called the BC Residential Tenancy Branch about this. And speaking of which, you go to arbitration through the BC Residential Tenancy Branch if you have a dispute. That's location 1. Let's go to Hawaii. Hawaii is where I also have rentals. In Hawaii, there are no pre-made forms, but there is sample warning of what, like a warning letter or notice of increase, things like that. So there is sample wording, but there's no pre-made forms. You have to take the information and create your own. And there are examples. In a month-to-month lease, this is one aspect that I see that is landlord friendly that most people miss. In a month-to-month lease, meaning you are not in a fixed lease term, with 45 days written notice to your tenant, you can quote unquote increase the rent to market rate. That's the wording. So whatever is deemed as market rate in Hawaii based on nothing, whatever market rate is, I mean, we kind of know, but you can increase it. And this could be hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So that is something that is unique to Hawaii. But I will tell you something that is really sad in Hawaii, that if you have a dispute, typically you go straight to court. The court will ask you to try to do mediation, which is free, but you typically will go straight to court. It can be incredibly anxiety inducing. All of this can be, but if there's any disputes, if you have abandoned items, if a tenant has either been evicted or you've had the unit has been abandoned, any abandoned items, you've got to involve a bailiff, and there are specific items, specific dates and deadlines that are involved with abandoned items in the state of Hawaii. Okay, let's move on to the province of Ontario. Ontario has got, outside of British Columbia, between British Columbia and Ontario, they have the most incredible pre-made forms. If you are looking for an example of a pre-made form, go to Ontario. BC's pretty good. Ontario's pretty good too. Their numbering of their forms is pretty good. It really plays into my OCD. But they have some weird things that go on in Ontario as well. For example, there is a 7-day grace period for rent payments, which is not automatic. I mean, it's 7 days, but that you also have to give a demand letter for this. So it's a little bit wonky. Rent increase, you can only do one rent increase per year. And the province, again, very similar to BC, will tell you what the rent increase can be. You can also put your application, when you're a potential tenant, you can receive an application based on your animals. You must declare your animals, which I think is very standard with others as well. Ontario does how to prepare for a death of a tenant very well. It states specifically in there that a potential tenant needs to declare to the landlord upon their death who is authorized to actually come and get the possessions and entry to the unit. There's a lot of places that don't actually spell this out, and it can be really disheartening when a tenant dies in the unit and a landlord is kind of stuck and you don't know what to do. But Ontario is very similar to British Columbia. Well done, Ontario. What's next? Number 4, Washington State. Washington State has a number of nuances. There's actually 3 ways to pay a security deposit at the start of a lease, and a landlord can dictate what goes on. So just be aware, but I've only seen these options in one place, and that's Washington so far. So the potential tenant can just straight up pay the security deposit, which is usually what happens in other locations. If the landlord allows, the security deposit can be paid in 3 installments, or instead of a security deposit, there can be a monthly fee that is paid on top of rent every month that is then basically the prorated security deposit. It's very interesting, and you don't have to do this as a landlord, but you can. In Washington State, there's an automatic 5-day grace period where you cannot charge a late fee at all, but on that 6th day, the late fee is charged through the 5th, right? Rent increases in the entire state are, I forget what the amount is, but I know Seattle is different. In Seattle, if you have a rental in Seattle, you have to give 180 days notice of a rent increase. Holy moly. It talks very, very specifically in Washington State about the retaliatory actions by a landlord. Also, they do death of a tenant very well. There's very good planning about death of a tenant for a landlord and a tenant in there. And for abandoned items, there is a threshold of $250 on what to do if there's valuables that is worth less than $250. There's a set of actions, and if it's worth more than $250, there's a set of actions. But Washington State is very interesting. New York, oh my goodness, New York State. I think I'm going to need to get a guest on the show about landlording in New York State. It is so incredible, because different locations, the age of buildings, the numbers of units, whether the unit is regulated or non-regulated, meaning is it under rent control? Is it rent stabilized? Those mean different things. And those regulated versus non-regulated, that impacts the lease renewal timing, the written notice you have to give the tenants for lease renewals, and how you deal with the security deposits, and what you can charge for rent. Also, the succession of the units, whether they're regulated or not, is impacted. I mean, it's really, really complicated. I was really shocked. And God bless you. I know I've got listeners out there in New York City. Thank you so much for listening. I am trying so hard to learn a little bit more about this, and I want to have some experts on that can specifically talk to us and untangle this about New York tenancies. Wow. Rent overcharges are permitted, and rent overcharge, listen to the podcast. It's really incredible what's been done in the past. You can tell that tenants just basically pay their landlords money on the side just to keep their units. There's a lot of discussion about subletting versus assigning versus apartment sharing, as well as pets in New York State. So that's a very interesting one. But let's move on to California. In California, all deposits cannot be no more than 1 month rents. And also there's got to be mandatory wording for sex offenders. This is known as Megan's Law. Megan's Law, you have to have wording in your lease warning people that there might be sex offenders living nearby them. Also, for a condition inspection or a move-in report, they call it an inventory checklist in California. It's actually really good. I'm actually pretty impressed. Late or NSF fee for payments is an additional charge. That's true. Late or NSF fee for payments can also be charged from a landlord. How rent increases work are differed by location. It's 5% plus whatever the consumer price index is, not to exceed 10%, but it is incredibly geographic specific. Very on it on where your rental is located, and it's by county. So you really want to do your homework on this. Great glossary of terms for California. And when you do a return of deposit, if the deductions are less than $125, you do not need to provide receipts. There is a clause in here about a tenant filing for bankruptcy, trying to avoid an eviction. There is some wording about how that all works. That's interesting. You must declare as a landlord if there has been a death in the rental in the last 3 years. Wow. Who knew about that? Now, you don't have to give the details of the death. I'm sure the neighbors will give the tenant the details of the death, but you have to disclose that. And also in California, you have the ability to offer positive rent history reporting. If a tenant wants that so that it helps their credit, you have to offer that. That's pretty interesting. Now let's move on to the great state of Texas. Texas, oh my goodness. I'm always entertained by Texas. Any place that's got gas stations as big as Buc-ee's is definitely going to have an entertaining tenancy law, and it does. Oh my goodness. So in Texas, there is specific information about bolding and underlining items in leases. It has to be a specific font size to make sure that you're not putting in little teeny tiny print. So you've got to make sure that things are readable, bolded, underlining in there. Also, there's no limits to rent increases in Texas. You can increase it anytime during the year from what I'm seeing. And there is no limit to the amount that you can increase it. Also, there's 2 types of insurance that a renter can get in Texas, something called a named perils policy or an all risk policy. Those are 2 different types, and they also define normal wear and tear in Texas. Also, I have to laugh because only in Texas would they specifically put something in their tenancy law that says a landlord cannot restrict the right for a tenant to lawfully possess a firearm. Yes, that is actually in there. And in Texas, between each tenancy, a landlord must rekey the locks each and every time. Very unique. Okay, moving on to Nebraska. Nebraska has a security deposit of 1 month's rent, but they also have a pet deposit of a 1/4 month's rent. They also have something really unique in Nebraska that I really like. It's called a 1430-day notice, and it works for both tenants and landlords. So let's say, for example, in Nebraska, a Nebraska landlord isn't making a repair, a tenant can make a request saying, you have 14 days to make this repair, Mr. Landlord, or at 30 days, I'm giving my notice to terminate. So 40 days to act, 30 days to terminate. But also the landlord can do this. The landlord can say, okay, tenant, stop behaving, stop with this behavior, or your tenancy terminates in 30 days. So it's very standard. I think this is really cool. Also in Nebraska, they define essential services, including hot and cold running water. It doesn't just say hot and cold water, hot and cold running water, sewage, or septic and electricity. It's also very specific about terminating leases due to domestic abuse or criminal activity. And there are other locations that specifically spell out early lease terminations due to safety issues. Also in Nebraska, they specifically say if a tenant is going to be gone for an extended period of time from a unit to let your landlord know. Some of this it makes a lot of sense. Moving on to Vermont. In Vermont, deposits must be in trust-bearing accounts in some locations, so you need to make sure you are aware of that, depending on where your rental is. They do also have some pre-made forms. Late fees can only be charged as part of the actual cost. When you do rent increase notices, depending on your location, you must either give a 60 or 90-day notice of the rent increase, and it is an abrupt end to a fixed lease. You have up to $3,000 mediation if you go to vermontlandlord.org. You want to make sure, oh, wait a minute, is it vermontlandlord.org? I think it is. Vermont Landlords Association will help you with the mediation. If you're trying to work this out between your landlord and your tenant, it is automatically paid up to $3,000 to help with that remediation. Vermont also talks about landlord retaliation and also about farm employee housing. In this tranche of location-specific episodes, Vermont was the only one that was talking specifically about employee work tied with housing. That was interesting. That's what I could find. And the last location in this tranche of location-specific podcasts is with the great province of Manitoba. I find it interesting that there is a habitually late charge. Let's see. If someone is habitually late in paying their rent, you can end tenancy. Now, that's not the unique thing. What is unique is that there is a pre-made letter that Manitoba can provide to landlords that if you want to terminate your tenancy because a tenant continually pays late, there is a pre-made letter. In fact, there's a ton of forms on the Manitoba Residential Tenancy Branch website that is just chock full of resources, and this is one of them. One other couple nuances. You cannot spell out a rent increase specifically for just the laundry facilities. That's kind of interesting. If you're a landlord in Manitoba and you're providing laundry, you can increase the rent, but you can't just increase the rent just for laundry. That's interesting. In a fixed lease in Manitoba, a renter is obligated to pay the remainder of the lease. That is not always true in locations. So you need to make sure you understand that in Manitoba. Pet damage deposit and a security deposit is a security deposit is a half month's rent. A pet damage deposit, it can be a full month's rent. And then if you're providing other services such as meals or transportation to the tenant, it's called a tenant services deposit. That can be up to another half month's rent. Very similar to how you do work in BC. In Manitoba is the first place that I saw something called a life lease as well. There's a specific act about people who are going to be in a unit for life, and how the money works and how the services work are very unique. I actually need to do some more research on that. In Manitoba, there are specific fees for NSF, late fees, administration fees, early termination fees, etc. But that is just a glimpse of what you can expect for the podcasts that are already live right now in the library. So I wanted to do a summary for that, introducing these 10 locations. And again, in each of my location-specific podcasts are set up the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of the tenancy law? What are different in that tenancy law location? What's some guidance about abandoned items left behind by a tenant in a residential unit? And where can you go for help in that location. This is the same format for every single location-specific episode. And so when you change geographic area, and as I add more location-specific podcast episodes in the library, you already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location. So I have to tell you, these episodes are not all inclusive. You must do your own research based on where your specific rental is and the applicability of the rules, regulations, guidance, ordinances, bylaws, all of the above in your specific area for your city, your county, your regional district, parish, et cetera, et cetera. This involves your specific rental location, but today's summary episode will let you know what just got added to the library overnight. And who knows, I suspect you'll be thumbing through the podcast library at My Life as a Landlord, and you'll find 1 or 2 or 10 episodes that you might just bookmark. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you are either a current landlord or about to be a landlord, or you want to be a landlord in a certain location. Please visit the My Life as a Landlord episode library to go to your specific location and learn more. Now, if you don't see your location yet, just have a little patience. It is on its way. And today I am recording this summary episode in New Zealand. I am actually on a cruise ship, the Carnival Splendor. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? In the meantime, join me in the very first location-specific episode, which is live right now in the library, episode 122, about the great Canadian province of British Columbia.